The dust swirled across the barren trail as Grace Nelson watched in stunned silence while the last wagon of the train disappeared over the horizon, taking with it her hopes, dreams, and everything she owned in the world. It was June 1867, and the Oregon Trail had claimed another victim not by death, but by cruel abandonment. Her ankle throbbed where she'd twisted it that morning, an injury that had slowed her pace just enough to be left behind by a wagon master more concerned with schedules than human lives. As tears threatened to spill down her dirt-streaked face, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn. There, silhouetted against the setting sun, was a lone figure on horseback. Miss Nelson. The familiar voice of Jake Lawson, the quiet cowboy who'd kept to himself for most of the journey, carried across the empty plain. He dismounted in a fluid motion, his tall frame casting a long shadow as he approached. "I saw them leave you. Couldn't believe my eyes." Grace swallowed hard, fighting to maintain her composure. Mr. Hargrove said they couldn't wait, said the schedule to reach the mountains before winter was more important then. She gestured helplessly to her swollen ankle. Jake's face hardened, his jaw set beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "More important than a person's life. That ain't right." He looked toward the distant dust cloud, then back at her. "Don't you worry, Miss Nelson, we'll catch up together." Those 4 simple words changed everything. In the vast emptiness of the western frontier, with danger lurking in every shadow and behind every rock, Jake Lawson had chosen to stay behind for her. "You can't," Grace protested, though something in her chest fluttered with hope. "You'll lose your place in the wagon train." "Your claim in Oregon wasn't much of a claim," Jake said with a slight shrug. "Just dreams and dust, same as most folks heading west." He glanced at her injured ankle. "Besides, a man who'd leave a woman alone out here ain't fit to lead anyone anywhere. We'll make our own way." Grace wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. At 22, she'd already buried her parents in Illinois and set out west with nothing but determination and their modest savings. Now here she was, stranded on the trail with a man she barely knew, yet something in his steady gaze made her believe that perhaps all was not lost. "Can you stand?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. Grace nodded and attempted to put weight on her injured ankle. She winced but managed to remain upright. "It's not broken, just badly twisted." "Good," Jake said. "We've got about an hour of daylight left. I figure we best make camp and set out at first light." He looked around, assessing their surroundings. "There's a small creek about half a mile back. Water for us and Brutus." He patted his horse's neck affectionately. "You've thought this through?" Grace asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Jake's lips quirked in a half-smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Been riding this land for 3 years, Miss Nelson. When I saw that wagon master giving orders to move out without you, I packed up what supplies I could and made my decision." For the first time since she'd fallen that morning, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson." "Jake," he corrected. "Figure if we're going to be traveling companions, we might as well use our given names." "Grace," she offered in return, and the name felt different somehow on the open plain with just the 2 of them to hear it. Jake nodded, then turned to his horse. "Let me get some of these supplies unpacked, and I'll help you to the creek. We need to get that ankle in some cold water." As Grace watched him efficiently unload his saddlebags, she realized how little she knew about this man who had just sacrificed his own journey for hers. Throughout the 2 months on the trail, Jake had kept to himself, riding alongside the wagons rather than sitting around the campfires at night. He was known to be a skilled hunter who occasionally shared his game with the group, but beyond that, he was a mystery. "Have you always been a cowboy?" she asked as he worked. Jake paused, considering her question. Started working cattle when I was 14. Rode with a few outfits across Texas, then New Mexico territory. Figured Oregon might be a nice change of pace. His hands resumed their work. What about you? What takes you west all alone? Grace looked down at her dusty hands. My parents died of fever last winter. There was nothing left for me in Illinois but memories and debts. I heard there were opportunities out west for those willing to work hard. Jake nodded. There are, if you know where to look and don't mind the work. He finished unpacking and turned to her. Ready to get to that creek? I'll help you walk. Grace hesitated, then nodded. As Jake came to her side and offered his arm, she noticed the calluses on his hands and the way his skin had been darkened by years under the sun. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the distance, and a weathered quality to his face that came from living outdoors. Yet there was a gentleness in how he supported her weight, careful not to cause her any additional pain. The journey to the creek was slow but manageable. When they reached the water, Jake helped Grace settle on a flat rock beside it. "Let's have a look at that ankle," he said, kneeling before her. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he removed her boot and rolled down her stocking to examine the swelling. "Nasty twist, but you're right, not broken." He cupped his hands and brought water to pour over the injury. "Keep it in the cold water for a while. I'll set up camp." Grace watched as Jake efficiently organized their impromptu campsite. He gathered wood for a fire, laid out their bedrolls at a respectable distance from each other, and began preparing a simple meal from his provisions. "I'm sorry I don't have more to contribute," Grace said, feeling guilty for her dependency. "My supplies were in the wagon." Jake shook his head. "Don't worry about that. I've got enough to get us started. Besides, once your ankle's better, we'll be hunting and gathering as we go." The thought of continuing their journey alone, just the two of them, sent a mix of emotions through Grace. Fear, certainly, but also a strange excitement she couldn't quite explain. "How far behind do you think we are?" she asked. Jake considered this as he stoked the fire. "They've got a few hours head start. With wagons, they're moving slower than we will on horseback. If your ankle heals well, we could catch them within a week." "And if we don't?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake's eyes met hers across the fire. "Then we make a new plan." "There's more than one way west, Grace." The way he said her name made her feel both vulnerable and protected at the same time. As night fell and the stars emerged above them, Grace found herself studying Jake's profile in the firelight. This man had chosen to stay behind for her, a woman he barely knew. In a world where self-preservation often trumped compassion, his decision stood out like a beacon. "You should get some rest," Jake said, interrupting her thoughts. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Grace nodded and adjusted herself on the bedroll he had laid out for her. Despite the discomfort of her ankle and the hard ground beneath her, she felt a strange sense of peace. "Good night, Jake," she said softly. "Good night, Grace," he replied, his voice a comforting rumble in the darkness. "Don't you worry. We're going to be just fine." As she drifted off to sleep, Grace couldn't help but wonder if his words were a promise not just for their journey, but for something more. The morning brought with it a clear sky and a noticeable improvement in Grace's ankle. Though still tender, the swelling had reduced considerably. Jake had already been up for some time, judging by the fresh coffee bubbling over the fire and the small rabbits roasting on a spit. "You're up early," Grace observed, carefully testing her ankle's mobility. Jake handed her a tin cup of coffee. "Old habits. How's the ankle feeling?" "Better than yesterday," she said, accepting the cup with gratitude. The warmth seeped into her fingers, a comfort against the morning chill. "I think I can ride today." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly. "You sure about that?" "No need to push too hard too fast." Grace sipped her coffee, the strong, bitter taste bringing her fully awake. "Mr. Lawson, Jake, I've been holding the wagon train back for days because of this injury. I won't do the same to you." A hint of respect flickered in Jake's eyes. "All right then. We'll take it slow at first, see how you manage." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, the rabbits more flavorful than anything Grace had eaten in weeks. The wagon train's meals had been communal affairs, bland and practical. Jake, it seemed, knew his way around a cooking fire. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Grace asked, finishing the last bite of her meal. Jake's expression softened with memory. "My mother taught me the basics before she passed. Said a man ought to know how to feed himself properly. The rest I picked up riding with different outfits." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Lost her when I was 12. Father followed 2 years later." Grace felt a pang of shared grief. "I'm sorry. It's hard, isn't it? Moving forward when they can't come with you." Jake nodded, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected vulnerability. "That it is. But moving is what we do, I reckon. Standing still just lets the dust cover you." There was something poetic in his straightforward wisdom that touched Grace deeply. In that moment, she realized they shared more than just their current predicament. They were both carrying the weight of lost family, seeking something new on the horizon. After breakfast, Jake helped Grace pack up their small camp. When it came time to mount Brutus, he fashioned a makeshift step from fallen logs to make it easier for her. "He's a good horse," Jake explained as he helped her up into the saddle. "Strong enough to carry us both for a few days until we can find you a mount of your own." Grace settled onto the saddle, acutely aware of how Jake would need to sit behind her. "I can ride," she assured him. "My father taught me on our farm." "Good," Jake said, swinging up behind her with practiced ease. "That'll make things easier." The proximity was immediate and unavoidable. Jake's chest pressed against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. Grace felt her cheeks warm and was grateful he couldn't see her face. "Comfortable?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. Then, gathering her composure, she said, "Yes, thank you." With a gentle click of his tongue, Jake urged Brutus forward. The horse responded immediately, setting off at an easy pace along the trail left by the wagon train. The hoofprints and wheel ruts were still clearly visible, a reminder of what they were chasing. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed from open plains to rolling hills dotted with scrubby vegetation. The June sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat tempered occasionally by a passing breeze. Jake was careful to stop periodically, ensuring that Grace's ankle had time to rest, and that Brutus wasn't overtaxed by carrying double his usual weight. During one such stop, as they shared a canteen of water beneath the sparse shade of a juniper tree, Grace found herself studying Jake openly. With his hat pushed back on his head and his guard slightly lowered, she could see him more clearly than ever before. "What made you decide to head to Oregon?" she asked. "You mentioned you've been riding for years. Why settle now?" Jake took a long drink before answering. Man can only drift so long before he starts wondering what it might be like to put down roots. He looked off into the distance. Heard tell of green valleys in Oregon, land for the taking. Thought maybe it was time to see if I could build something that lasts. "A ranch?" Grace asked. Jake nodded. "Maybe, or just a decent-sized farm, something with good water and enough grass for some cattle." He glanced at her. "What about you? What were you hoping to find?" Grace considered her answer carefully. "A new beginning, I suppose." "My father was a school teacher, and my mother taught me to read and write well. I thought perhaps I could find work as a teacher in one of the new settlements." She smiled wistfully. "I brought books in my trunk, novels and primers and history texts, all left behind in the wagon now." Jake's expression changed subtly. "What wagon was your trunk in?" "The Hendersons," Grace replied. "They offered to carry my things since I was traveling alone." A slow smile spread across Jake's face. "Well now, that's a piece of luck." The Hendersons' wagon was near the back, and when I saw what was happening, I managed to grab a few things from the wagons before riding after you. He reached into one of his saddlebags and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "Couldn't get much, but I saw this and figured it might be important." Grace gasped as she recognized her mother's Bible. Inside the cover were the family records, births, deaths, marriages, the only written history she had of her family. She took it with trembling hands, tears welling in her eyes. "How did you know?" she whispered. Jake shrugged, looking almost embarrassed by her emotion. "Saw you reading from it most nights, figured it meant something to you." The simple act of kindness touched Grace more deeply than anything had in months. Without thinking, she leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on Jake's cheek. "Thank you," she said softly. Jake's eyes widened slightly and a flush crept up from his collar. He cleared his throat and stood abruptly. "We should get moving if we want to make good time today." As they continued their journey, Grace held the Bible close, finding comfort in its familiar weight. Jake remained quiet behind her, but there was a new awareness between them, a shift in the air that neither acknowledged but both could feel. By late afternoon, they came upon a small stream cutting through a meadow filled with wildflowers. Jake guided Brutus to the water's edge and dismounted, then helped Grace down carefully. "We'll make camp here for the night," he said, his hands lingering slightly at her waist before he stepped back. "Good water, good grazing for Brutus, and some shelter from those trees if the weather turns." Grace nodded her agreement, testing her ankle. It was sore but functional, a good sign for their progress. "I'll gather firewood," she offered, eager to contribute. Jake looked as if he might protest, then thought better of it. "Stay within sight," he cautioned instead. "And don't push that ankle too hard." As Grace collected fallen branches from the edge of the small copse of trees, she pondered the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. If she hadn't twisted her ankle, if the wagon master hadn't been so callous, if Jake hadn't been the kind of man who would stay behind for a virtual stranger, none of this would be happening. By the time she returned with an armload of wood, Jake had already unpacked their meager supplies and was preparing to fish in the stream. He looked up as she approached, a genuine smile warming his features. "Good haul," he commented, taking some of the wood from her arms. "You've got an eye for the dry stuff. Farm life teaches you a few things," Grace replied, arranging the remaining branches for a fire. "Though I admit, I never imagined I'd be putting those skills to use like this." Jake knelt beside her to help build the fire. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, sometimes for the worse." He glanced at her, his eyes catching the late afternoon light, "and sometimes for the better." The implication hung between them as they worked together to prepare their camp. By the time night fell, they had a cheerful fire crackling, 2 fish roasting on improvised spits, and a sense of accomplishment that neither had anticipated. As they ate dinner under a canopy of stars, Grace found herself wondering what the wagon train was doing, whether anyone there had given a thought to the 2 they'd left behind. Somehow, it mattered less than it had that morning. "Penny for your thoughts?" Jake asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Grace smiled. "I was just thinking about how quickly things can change. Yesterday morning, I was part of a wagon train headed for a new life in Oregon. Tonight—" She gestured to their small camp, the crackling fire, the vast wilderness around them. "Having regrets?" Jake's question was casual, but Grace sensed an underlying concern. She shook her head firmly. "No, strange as it may sound, I feel more present than I have since leaving Illinois." On the wagon train, I was just one more body moving west, following someone else's schedule, someone else's rules. She looked directly at Jake. This feels different. Jake held her gaze, the firelight dancing across his features. Different good or different bad? Different good, Grace replied softly. Very good. The admission seemed to please him, though he tried to hide it by poking at the fire. Well, we've made decent progress today. If your ankle keeps improving, we might catch the train sooner than I thought. Grace nodded, though a small part of her wondered if catching up was still what she wanted. The thought startled her, and she quickly pushed it aside as impractical fancy. What if we don't catch them? She asked instead. What then? Jake considered this, his expression thoughtful. There's a trading post about 4 days' ride from here, if I remember correctly. We could resupply there, maybe find you a horse. He hesitated, then added, after that, we could still head to Oregon just on our own path. Just the two of us. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Unless you'd prefer otherwise, Jake replied, his voice carefully neutral. Grace found herself at a crossroads, one she hadn't anticipated when the day began. The practical choice would be to catch the wagon train, safety in numbers, the established route, the certainty of arriving with others. Yet something about the alternative called to her, a freedom she hadn't known she craved. I think, she said slowly, that I would like to see this trading post before deciding. Jake nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Fair enough. We'll take it one day at a time. As they prepared for sleep, Jake ensured that their bedrolls were still placed at a respectful distance from each other. But somehow the space between them felt less significant than before. Grace lay awake for a long time, listening to the night sounds and Jake's steady breathing, wondering at the strange path her life had taken and where it might lead next. The next 3 days settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. They would rise with the sun, share a simple breakfast, and ride until midday. After a rest, they would continue until finding a suitable place to camp for the evening. Jake taught Grace to fish in the streams they crossed and showed her which plants were safe to gather for food. In return, she shared stories from the books she had read, expanding their evening conversations beyond the immediate concerns of survival. Grace's ankle improved steadily, allowing her to take on more camp duties and even ride Brutus alone for short stretches while Jake walked alongside, giving the horse a break from their combined weight. During these periods, they would talk more freely, learning about each other's pasts and dreams for the future. Jake, she discovered, had a quick mind that belied his quiet demeanor. He'd had little formal education, but had picked up knowledge wherever he could, developing a practical intelligence that Grace found increasingly impressive. He spoke of the different territories he'd crossed, the people he'd encountered, and the skills he'd acquired along the way. For her part, Grace shared memories of her childhood in Illinois, her father's dedication to education, and her mother's love of literature. Jake listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he valued her experiences and thoughts. By the afternoon of the 4th day, they crested a hill to find a small settlement nestled in the valley below. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and a handful of buildings clustered around what appeared to be a central trading post. There it is, Jake said, pointing. Hammond's trading post. Not much to look at, but it's an important stop for travelers and trappers in these parts. Grace felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. After days with just Jake for company, the prospect of other people seemed almost jarring. Will they have supplies we need? She asked, adjusting her position in the saddle. Jake nodded. Basic provisions, ammunition, maybe some clothing, and with luck a horse for you. He glanced at her. Ready, Grace took a deep breath and nodded. As they descended toward the settlement, She couldn't help but notice how Jake's posture had changed, becoming more alert, more guarded. It reminded her that the world they were entering held different dangers than the wilderness they'd traversed. The trading post consisted of a main building with attached living quarters, a small stable, and what appeared to be a rudimentary blacksmith's forge. A few other structures, likely homes or workshops, were scattered nearby. Several horses were hitched outside the main building, suggesting other travelers were present. Jake helped Grace dismount when they reached the hitching post, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. The brief contact sent a flutter through her stomach that she was finding increasingly difficult to ignore. "Stay close," he murmured, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Trading posts can attract all sorts." The interior of the trading post was dimly lit but well stocked, with shelves of goods lining the walls and barrels containing everything from flour to nails scattered across the floor. The proprietor, a burly man with a thick beard streaked with gray, looked up as they entered. "Afternoon," he greeted them. "Don't often see new faces this time of year. Most of the wagon trains passed through weeks ago." Jake nodded respectfully. "We're traveling independently, had some delays." The man's eyes moved to Grace, then back to Jake with a knowing look that made her uncomfortable. "I see. Well, name's Hammond. This here's my post. What can I do for you folks?" "We need supplies," Jake said, getting straight to business. "And a horse for the lady if you've got one for sale." Hammond stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Might have what you need. Just got in some dried goods from the east, and I've got a gentle mare that might suit the lady." He looked at Grace again, this time with more curiosity than judgment. "You two headed to Oregon like the rest?" "That's the plan," Jake replied before Grace could answer. She noticed how he avoided confirming they were together or explaining their circumstances, a prudent caution in unfamiliar territory. "Well, you're welcome to stay the night," Hammond offered. "Got a small room in the back for travelers. Cost you extra, of course, but it's got a real bed. Otherwise, you can camp just outside of town for free." Jake glanced at Grace, silently deferring the decision to her. The prospect of a real bed after days on the trail was tempting, but something about the trading post, or perhaps its proprietor, made her uneasy. "I think we'll camp," she said, meeting Jake's eyes briefly. "But thank you for the offer." Hammond shrugged. "Suit yourselves." Now, about those supplies. The next hour was spent selecting the necessities they could afford with Jake's limited funds. Grace was touched to see him prioritize items for her comfort: a small pot of salve for her ankle, a comb for her hair, and a light blanket to supplement the bedroll. When he thought she wasn't looking, he also added a small notebook and pencil to their purchases, remembering her mention of wanting to keep a record of their journey. The negotiation for the horse took longer. The mare Hammond offered was indeed gentle, but she was also older than ideal for the journey ahead. After some haggling, they reached an agreement that included both the horse and a basic saddle. "Name's Daisy," Hammond said as he led the dappled gray mare out to them. "She ain't fast, but she's sure-footed and calm. Good for a lady rider." Grace approached the horse slowly, offering her hand for the mare to sniff. Daisy's soft muzzle tickled her palm, and the horse's gentle brown eyes seemed to assess her with equal curiosity. "Hello, Daisy," Grace murmured, stroking the mare's neck. "You and I are going to be friends, I think." Jake watched the interaction with approval. "She's got good instincts," he commented to Hammond, though his eyes remained on Grace. "The horse or the lady?" Hammond asked with a chuckle. Jake's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Both." With their business concluded, they led both horses to the edge of the settlement where a small creek provided fresh water and good grazing. Jake helped Grace set up their camp with practiced efficiency, and soon they had a fire going as the sun began to set. "What do you think?" Jake asked as they sat beside the fire, eating a supper improved by the fresh supplies they'd purchased. "About the trading post, I mean." Grace considered her answer carefully. "It's good to know it's here if we need it, but I'm glad we decided to camp outside." Jake nodded, seeming pleased by her assessment. "Hammond's decent enough, but places like this attract all types. Best to keep our business private and move on." He hesitated, then added, "Speaking of moving on, we need to decide our next steps. The wagon train is at least 3 days ahead by now, maybe more." The moment of decision had arrived, and Grace found herself surprisingly clear about what she wanted. The days spent with Jake had shown her a different kind of journey, one where she wasn't just a passenger, but an equal partner. The thought of rejoining the wagon train, with its rigid hierarchy and the wagon master who had abandoned her, held little appeal. "I don't think we need to catch the train," she said quietly, meeting Jake's surprised gaze. "Not if there's another way to Oregon." Jake studied her face as if searching for uncertainty. "There are other routes, longer, maybe more challenging in some ways, but—" He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But we'd be free to move at our own pace, make our own decisions." "That's what I want," Grace said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "I left Illinois to find a new life, not to follow someone else's path. If you're willing to continue together, I'd prefer we make our own way." Something shifted in Jake's expression, relief, perhaps, or a deeper emotion he wasn't ready to name. "Together, then," he agreed, the word carrying more weight than its simple syllables suggested. As night fell around them, their conversation turned to practical matters: the route they would take, the supplies they would need, the challenges they might face. Yet underlying it all was a new understanding, an acknowledgement that their partnership had become something chosen rather than circumstantial. When Grace finally lay down to sleep, her last thought before drifting off was that, for the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. Morning brought a crisp clarity to both the air and their plans. After a quick breakfast, Jake helped Grace saddle Daisy, showing her the proper way to secure the cinch and position the blanket. "She's a good horse," Jake observed as Grace stroked Daisy's nose. "Not young, but experienced. That counts for a lot on the trail." Grace nodded, already feeling an affinity for the gentle mare. "I think we understand each other, both of us starting a new journey later than expected." Jake's expression softened. "It's never too late to find where you belong." The simple statement carried a weight that made Grace's heart quicken. She busied herself with adjusting Daisy's bridle to hide the blush she felt rising to her cheeks. They departed the trading post with minimal fanfare, Jake leading them northwest along a trail less traveled than the main Oregon route. According to his explanation, they would follow this path to the Snake River, then trace it into Oregon territory. The journey would be longer, but would avoid some of the more treacherous mountain passes that the wagon trains had to navigate. With Daisy beneath her, Grace found a new freedom in their travel. She could ride alongside Jake now, allowing for easier conversation as they made their way through increasingly varied terrain. The plains gradually gave way to rolling hills, and by midday, they could see distant mountains on the horizon. "Those are the beginnings of the Rocky Mountains," Jake explained when Grace asked about them. "We'll skirt around rather than going over. Takes longer, but it's safer, especially with just the two of us." Grace appreciated his practical approach to their safety, another reminder of how fortunate she had been when he chose to stay behind with her. "Have you traveled this route before?" she asked. Jake nodded. "Parts of it. Rode with a cattle drive that went this way about 2 years back." beautiful country, but demands respect. You've seen so much of this land, Grace observed. I can hardly imagine what it's like to have traveled so extensively. Jake was quiet for a moment. It's a gift and a burden. You see things most folks only read about, but there's a loneliness to it. He glanced at her. Until recently. The implication wasn't lost on Grace. She offered him a smile that acknowledged his words without pressing for more. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each absorbed in their own thoughts but acutely aware of the other's presence. By late afternoon, they reached a small valley where a clear stream cut through lush grass perfect for camping. As they set up their now familiar routine, Grace realized how much more capable she felt than just a few days before. She could now gather the right kinds of firewood, help prepare their camp, and contribute to their meals by identifying edible plants Jake had taught her to recognize. After dinner, as they sat by the fire watching the stars appear one by one, Jake pulled something from his saddlebag and handed it to Grace. "Almost forgot about this," he said, a hint of shyness in his gesture. "Picked it up at the trading post." Grace unwrapped the small package to find the notebook and pencil she had seen him purchase. "Oh, Jake," she breathed, running her fingers over the simple leather cover. "It's wonderful. Thought you might like to keep track of our journey," he explained. "You mentioned wanting to write things down and well." He shrugged, as if embarrassed by his own thoughtfulness. Grace moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Thank you. Not just for this, but for everything." She hesitated, then added softly, "I can't imagine making this journey with anyone else." Jake's eyes reflected the firelight as he turned to her, their faces now just inches apart. "Grace, He swallowed, seemingly struggling to find the right words. "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm glad I stayed behind that day." The air between them seemed charged with unspoken feelings. Grace felt herself leaning slightly closer, drawn by something both frightening and irresistible. Jake's hand moved to gently touch her cheek, a question in his eyes. Grace answered by closing the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that started tentatively but quickly deepened with shared longing. His arms encircled her, strong and secure, as she melted into the embrace she had been imagining for days without fully admitting it to herself. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the trading post," he confessed. "Maybe even before." Grace smiled, her heart racing. "I wouldn't have objected if you had." Jake chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her, noted for future reference. They stayed by the fire late into the night, talking more openly than ever before. Jake spoke of his dreams for Oregon, not just a farm or ranch, but a home, something he hadn't truly had since his parents died. Grace shared her hopes of perhaps starting a small school once they settled, putting her education to use in communities that needed it. "We could find a place that needs both," Jake suggested, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the flames dance. "Good land for farming, close enough to a settlement that needs a schoolteacher." The casual "we" in his statement warmed Grace more than the fire ever could. It wasn't a proposal, not yet, but it was a vision of a shared future that seemed increasingly possible with each passing day. When they finally retired to their separate bedrolls, placed closer together than in previous nights but still maintaining propriety, Grace lay awake for a long time. The kiss had changed things between them, acknowledging feelings that had been building since Jake first rode back for her. Yet it wasn't just the physical attraction that occupied her thoughts, but the deeper connection. They were forming a partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection. The next week of travel brought them deeper into the foothills of the mountains, following Jake's alternative route toward Oregon. Each day strengthened their bond, both as traveling companions and as a couple gradually acknowledging their feelings for one another. They settled into a routine that played to each of their strengths, Jake hunting and navigating, Grace maintaining their supplies, and increasingly taking charge of their camp setup. The landscape changed dramatically as they traveled, from open plains to forested hills, with streams cutting through valleys rich with game and edible plants. Jake proved to be a patient teacher, showing Grace how to identify animal tracks, predict weather changes from cloud patterns, and navigate by the stars when necessary. For her part, Grace brought a different kind of knowledge to their partnership. During the evenings, she would sometimes read aloud from her mother's Bible, the stories taking on new meaning in the vast wilderness around them. She taught Jake songs she remembered from her childhood, filling their campsites with melodies that chased away the loneliness of the trail. Their physical relationship progressed with cautious respect. Kisses became more frequent and lingering, embraces more natural as they sat by the fire each night. Yet Jake maintained a gentleman's restraint, never presuming more than Grace was ready to give. This consideration only deepened her growing feelings for him. 10 days after leaving the trading post, they crested a ridge to find a breathtaking vista spread before them, a wide valley with a river snaking through it, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. "The Snake River Valley," Jake announced with obvious satisfaction. "We'll follow it northwest from here. Another 2 weeks should see us into Oregon Territory proper." Grace reined Daisy to a stop beside Brutus, taking in the magnificent view. "It's beautiful," she breathed, the vastness of the landscape making her feel simultaneously small and part of something immense. Jake smiled, watching her reaction rather than the view itself. "Thought you might appreciate it. There's good camping by the river and we could use a day of rest." The horses, too. The suggestion of a day without travel was appealing after nearly 2 weeks on the trail. Though they had settled into a comfortable rhythm, the constant movement took its toll on both body and spirit. A chance to simply be still, to appreciate where they were rather than focusing on where they were going, seemed like a luxury worth embracing. They made their way down to the river, finding a protected spot beneath a stand of cottonwoods where the ground was level and the water accessible. By mid-afternoon, they had established the most comfortable camp of their journey so far, complete with a stone-ringed fire pit and makeshift seats fashioned from fallen logs. "I'll catch us some fish for dinner," Jake offered after ensuring the horses were properly tended. "Rivers teeming with them." Grace nodded, already planning to gather some of the wild onions and berries she had spotted on their descent. "I'll have a fire ready when you return." It struck her, as she watched him walk toward the river with his fishing line, how domestic their interaction had become. In just 2 weeks, they had developed the easy coordination of a long-established couple, anticipating each other's needs and dividing tasks without discussion. The realization brought a smile to her face and a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. By the time Jake returned with an impressive string of trout, Grace had prepared more than just a fire. She had arranged their campsite into something approaching a proper outdoor living space, with their bedrolls laid out side by side under the shelter of a large cottonwood. A small table-like arrangement of flat stones for preparing food, and a bouquet of wildflowers stuck into an empty can from their supplies. Jake paused at the edge of the camp, taking in her efforts with obvious appreciation. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you were settling in permanently," he teased, though his smile showed he was pleased. Grace shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "If we're staying for a day, we might as well be comfortable." "It's perfect," Jake assured her, setting down his catch and crossing to where she stood. Without hesitation, he pulled her into an embrace, his kiss conveying what words might not adequately express. When they parted, he added softly, "You make anywhere feel like home." The simple statement touched something deep within Grace. Home had been an abstract concept since her parents' deaths, a memory of what was lost, a hope for what might someday be found again. That Jake could associate her presence with such a fundamental comfort was both humbling and exhilarating. Their evening meal was a feast by trail standards: fresh fish seasoned with wild herbs, berries for dessert, and even coffee brewed from their precious remaining supply. As darkness fell, they sat side by side against one of the logs, watching the stars emerge in a sky unmarred by artificial light. "I've been thinking," Jake said after a comfortable silence. "About Oregon." Grace turned to look at him, curious about his tone. "What about it?" Jake seemed to consider his words carefully before continuing. "When I first decided to head west, I was just looking for land and a fresh start. Didn't much care where exactly I ended up, so long as it was mine." He paused, his eyes meeting hers in the firelight. "But now I'm thinking more specifically about the Willamette Valley. It's supposed to be some of the most fertile land in the territory, with established settlements nearby." "It sounds wonderful," Grace replied, hearing the question beneath his statement. "Why that area in particular?" Jake's hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally. "The settlement of Lafayette is there, small but growing. I've heard they're in need of a schoolteacher." He squeezed her hand gently. "And the land around it is good for raising cattle." The implication was clear: he was considering their future together, planning for both their dreams. The thoughtfulness of it made Grace's heart swell with emotion. "Jake," she began, her voice soft with feeling, "are you asking what I think you're asking?" He shifted to face her more directly, taking both her hands in his. "I know it's soon. We've only known each other a few weeks, but Grace—" He took a deep breath. "I've crossed this country more times than I can count, and I've never felt like I was heading home until now, until you." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming joy. "I feel the same way," she whispered. Jake's expression lightened with hope. "Then what do you say? When we reach Oregon, would you consider becoming my wife, building that life together, your school, my ranch, our home?" The question hung in the air between them, momentous yet somehow inevitable, as if their journey had been leading to this moment from the first day Jake had stayed behind for her. "Yes," Grace answered without hesitation, her voice clear despite the emotion tightening her throat. "Yes, I would consider it. In fact," she added with a smile, "I've already made up my mind." Jake's face broke into a grin that transformed his usually serious features. He pulled her to him in a kiss that sealed their promise to one another, full of passion and tenderness and the certainty of shared tomorrows. When they finally separated, both breathless and laughing softly with happiness, Jake pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't have a ring to give you," he apologized. Grace shook her head. "I don't need one, not now." She touched his face gently. "This what we've found together is worth more than any ring." They spent the rest of the evening making plans and sharing dreams, their future taking shape in the words they exchanged. The idea of Lafayette became more concrete with each detail they discussed: where they might build, how Grace would organize her school, what crops and cattle Jake would raise. What had begun as a desperate journey after abandonment was transforming into a purposeful quest toward something better than either had imagined alone. Later, as they lay in their bedrolls beneath the vast canopy of stars, Grace reached for Jake's hand across the small space that separated them. His fingers closed around hers immediately, a tangible connection mirroring the deeper bond they had formed. "Good night, my love," he murmured, the endearment new but fitting perfectly. "Good night," Grace replied, the word carrying all the contentment she felt in that moment. As she drifted toward sleep, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that terrible moment when she'd watched the wagon train disappear. What had seemed like disaster had led her to exactly where and with whom she was meant to be. Their day of rest stretched into two, both of them reluctant to leave the idyllic spot by the river. They used the time to mend clothing, reorganize their supplies, and explore the immediate area. Jake showed Grace how to set snares for rabbits, adding to their practical knowledge for the journey ahead and their eventual settlement. On the morning of the third day, they packed up camp and resumed their journey, following the Snake River northwest as planned. The terrain grew more challenging as they traveled, with the river cutting through increasingly rugged country. Yet their spirits remained high, buoyed by the commitment they had made to each other and the clear purpose of their journey. The next week brought a mixture of difficult terrain and breathtaking beauty. They forded small tributary streams, navigated rocky passages where the river narrowed between cliffs, and traversed meadows bursting with wildflowers. Throughout it all, they worked as a seamless team, Jake's experience complemented by Grace's quick learning and determination. Their evenings were spent planning their future in increasing detail. Jake sketched rough maps of the Willamette Valley based on descriptions he'd heard, marking possible locations for their homestead. Grace used her new notebook to draft ideas for her school curriculum, occasionally reading passages aloud for Jake's input. 12 days after leaving their riverside camp, they encountered the first sign of other travelers' smoke from a distant campfire visible as they crested a hill late in the afternoon. Jake immediately grew cautious, scanning the surrounding area with narrowed eyes. "Could be friendly settlers or trappers," he said, keeping his voice low though they were still far from the source of the smoke. "Could be others. Best approach carefully." Grace nodded, understanding his concern. Though they had been fortunate to avoid trouble so far, the Western Territories held many dangers beyond the natural challenges of the landscape. Bandits, hostile encounters, and desperate individuals pushed to extremes by the harsh conditions were all possibilities they had discussed but not yet faced. "Should we avoid them entirely?" she asked, also keeping her voice down. Jake considered this, then shook his head. "Might be good to get news of what's ahead. Just stay close to me and let me do the talking at first." They approached the campsite slowly, making enough noise with their horses to announce their presence rather than appearing suddenly. As they drew closer, they could see 3 wagons arranged in a protective semicircle, with a fire burning at the center of the encampment. "Hello, the camp," Jake called when they were within earshot but still at a safe distance. "Travelers approaching." A man emerged from behind one of the wagons, rifle in hand but not raised threateningly. "That's close enough until we know you," he called back. "State your business." "Just passing through," Jake replied evenly. "Heading to Oregon Territory, saw your smoke and thought to check if all was well." The man studied them for a moment, then lowered his rifle slightly. "You two alone out here?" Jake nodded. "Yes, sir, making our own way since leaving a wagon train back east." This seemed to surprise the man. He turned and called over his shoulder, "Martha, come see this." A woman appeared from one of the wagons, wiping her hands on an apron. Her expression changed from wariness to astonishment as she took in Grace and Jake on their horses. "Lord above," she exclaimed. "It's a woman traveling with just one man. Are you two married, dear?" The question was directed at Grace with frank curiosity. Before Grace could answer, Jake spoke up smoothly. "Engaged to be, madam, once we reach Oregon." He glanced at Grace with a smile that carried their private understanding of the truth in his words. This explanation seemed to satisfy the woman, who nodded approvingly. "Well, you two must be tired and hungry. Come join us for supper, we've plenty to share." After a quick exchange of glances with Grace that confirmed her willingness, Jake accepted the invitation. They dismounted and led their horses into the camp, where they were introduced to the Miller family, Samuel and Martha, their 3 children, and Samuel's brother James with his wife Rebecca. "We're part of a smaller wagon train that split off from the main route," Samuel explained as they settled around the fire. "Heard there was better land north of the usual settlements, so we decided to try our luck. Lost 2 wagons back at the river crossing," James added grimly. "Family decided to turn back. Can't say I blame them after what happened." Grace and Jake exchanged curious glances. "What did happen?" Jake asked. Martha shook her head sadly. "Their youngest took sick, and they lost him 2 days before the crossing. Then their wagon overturned in the ford, lost most of their supplies. Some sorrows are too much to bear alongside the journey's hardships." The somber news reminded them all of the high stakes involved in westward travel. Grace felt a renewed appreciation for Jake's skills and experience that had kept them safe thus far, as well as for the good fortune they had enjoyed despite their unconventional start. As the evening progressed, the initial wariness gave way to the camaraderie of shared experiences. The Millers proved to be good company, offering information about the trail ahead and news from the territories they had passed through. In return, Jake shared his knowledge of the route they were following and his plans for settling in the Willamette Valley. "We've heard good things about that area too," Samuel commented, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Might be worth considering if the northern claims don't pan out." The children, initially shy around the newcomers, gradually warmed to Grace when she offered to show them some simple games she had taught her young students back in Illinois. Soon, they were laughing together as if they'd known each other for months rather than hours. Jake watched her with the children, a soft expression on his face that didn't go unnoticed by Martha. The older woman sidled up to him as he helped Samuel check on the horses. "Your intended has a way with little ones," she observed with a knowing smile. Jake nodded, his eyes still on Grace. "She was a teacher back east, plans to start a school once we're settled." "A good match then," Martha said approvingly. "You building, her teaching, makes for a strong foundation." She paused, then added with motherly directness, "When exactly are you planning to make it official?" Jake felt a flush creep up his neck, unused to such personal inquiries. "As soon as possible once we reach Lafayette. Need to establish ourselves first, find a preacher." Martha nodded sagely. "Well, as luck would have it, James there was a preacher back in Missouri before he got the westward itch. Still has his credentials and performs the occasional service when needed." The implication was clear, and Jake found himself considering a possibility he hadn't anticipated. He looked back at Grace, laughing with the children in the firelight, and felt a certainty that had been growing stronger with each day of their journey together. Later, when the Miller family had retired to their wagons and Grace and Jake were preparing their own bedrolls a short distance from the main camp, he broached the subject carefully. "The Millers seem like good folks," he began, arranging his saddle as a makeshift pillow. Grace nodded, combing out her long hair in the firelight. "They do. Those children are delightful, especially little Emma." She smiled at the memory of the 6-year-old's infectious laughter. It was nice to be around a family again. Jake watched her, gathering his courage. Martha mentioned something interesting about James being a preacher. Grace's hands stilled in her hair. "Did she?" Said he still performs marriages when needed. Jake moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Got me thinking about waiting until Oregon versus." He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Grace's eyes widened with understanding. "Versus not waiting," Jake nodded, his expression earnest in the flickering light. "I know we talked about settling first, building a proper home, and we still will. But being out here, facing each day not knowing what's coming." He squeezed her hands gently. "I don't want to waste a single day not being your husband if you'll have me now." The proposition hung between them, unexpected but somehow perfectly right for their unconventional journey. Grace felt her heart swell with emotion as she considered his words. "Are you proposing we get married tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's smile was tender. "I believe I am. That is, if you're willing to become Mrs. Lawson with just the Millers as witnesses and the open sky as our chapel." Grace didn't need to think about her answer. The weeks on the trail had shown her everything she needed to know about Jake's character, his steadfastness, his integrity. What they had found together was rare and precious. Why wait to acknowledge it fully? "Yes," she said simply, her smile radiant in the firelight. "Nothing would make me happier than to be your wife tomorrow." Jake's face lit up with joy. He pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that spoke of both love and relief. When they finally separated, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I promise to be a good husband to you, Grace," he murmured. "To protect you, provide for you, stand by you through whatever life brings." Grace touched his face gently, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "And I promise to be a good wife to you, Jake, to support your dreams, share your burdens, and love you faithfully for all our days." They sealed these early vows with another kiss, both aware that the simple ceremony tomorrow would only formalize what their hearts had already decided. As they settled into their separate bedrolls for what would be their last night apart, Grace felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the trials and unexpected turns of her journey had been leading her to this moment, this man, this life they would build together. Morning brought clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for a wedding, as Martha declared when Grace shared their decision over breakfast. The older woman immediately took charge of the preparations, sending her husband and brother-in-law to help Jake create a suitable location for the ceremony, while she and Rebecca attended to Grace. "Every bride deserves to look special on her wedding day, even on the trail," Martha insisted, pulling a trunk from her wagon. From it, she produced a length of white ribbon. "Not much, but we can weave it through your hair with some wildflowers, make you a proper bridal crown." Grace was touched by the gesture. She had given little thought to her appearance, assuming the ceremony would be entirely practical given their circumstances. That these relative strangers would go to such efforts on her behalf brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I never expected." "Hush now," Martha said kindly, patting her hand. "James doesn't get many chances to perform weddings out here. Let us enjoy making it special." The morning passed in a flurry of simple but meaningful preparations. Rebecca helped Grace wash her hair in the stream and arranged it with the ribbon and delicate blue wildflowers gathered by the children. Martha insisted she wear a clean white blouse borrowed from her own trunk, slightly large but brightened by another ribbon at the waist. Meanwhile, Jake found himself similarly fussed over by the men. Samuel loaned him a relatively clean kerchief to wear at his neck, and James offered advice on the ceremony along with congratulations. "Never seen a couple come together quite like you two," the former preacher commented as they arranged stones in a rough circle for the ceremony space. "But there's something right about it. Something meant." Jake nodded, grateful for the man's acceptance and support. "Feels that way to us too." By midday, everything was ready. The Millers had created a surprising amount of ceremony from their limited resources. The stone circle had been supplemented with branches of pine and more wildflowers. The children had been scrubbed clean and given small bundles of flowers to hold. Even the campfire had been built up to provide a warm centerpiece for the gathering. Jake stood with James at the edge of the circle, his hat in his hands, heart pounding with anticipation. When Grace appeared, led by Martha from the direction of the stream, his breath caught in his throat. She was still wearing her trail clothes, save for the borrowed white blouse, but the wildflowers in her hair and the ribbon at her waist transformed her. More than that, it was the radiance of her smile as her eyes found his across the circle that made her the most beautiful bride he could imagine. The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt. James spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the commitment they were making to one another, and the particular strength needed for a union forged on the frontier. When it came time for them to speak their vows, Jake took Grace's hands in his, the words coming from his heart rather than any memorized formula. Grace, when I stayed behind that day, I never imagined I was riding toward the greatest blessing of my life. You've shown me what it means to have a partner in every sense, someone to share the trail with, to face challenges beside, to dream with. His voice grew husky with emotion. I promise to be your protector, your provider, your companion in all things. To build a home and a life with you, wherever the trail leads us. To love you faithfully until my last breath. Grace's eyes shimmered with tears as she responded, her voice clear despite her emotion. Jake, you came back for me when everyone else left. You taught me to see strength in myself I never knew I had. You've become my compass, my shelter, my heart's true home. She squeezed his hands. I promise to stand by your side through whatever lies ahead, to help build the dream we share, to be your faithful wife and loving companion for all our days together. James nodded approvingly at their personal vows, then continued with the traditional pronouncement. When he finally declared them husband and wife, Jake didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. He pulled Grace to him in an embrace that conveyed everything words couldn't express: his joy, his love, his absolute certainty in their future together. The Millers erupted in cheers and applause, the children throwing wildflower petals into the air around them. What followed was as close to a wedding feast as could be managed on the trail. Martha had secretly prepared a special meal, including a small cake made from precious sugar and dried fruit reserves she'd been saving for a special occasion. As the celebration continued through the afternoon, Grace found a moment to speak privately with Jake, drawing him away from the others to the shade of a nearby tree. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Lawson?" he asked, his arm around her waist. Grace smiled up at him, her expression serene yet full of joy. "Like the most natural thing in the world, as if I've always been meant to carry your name." She touched his face gently. "How does it feel to be a husband?" Jake's smile was tender as he covered her hand with his own. "Like finding something I didn't even know I was searching for until I found you." He kissed her softly. "Thank you for saying yes both times." They rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from their new friends. As evening approached, Samuel made an unexpected proposal. "We've been talking," he said, gesturing to include his family. "We're headed in roughly the same direction for at least another week's travel. Might make sense to continue together, safety in numbers and all that." Jake looked to Grace, silently seeking her opinion. Though they had grown accustomed to their independence, the practical advantages of traveling with others were significant. Additionally, she had clearly enjoyed the company, especially that of the children. "We would welcome your company," Grace answered for them both, receiving Jake's approving nod. "If you're sure we won't slow you down." Samuel chuckled. "Way Jake here talks about the trail ahead, Reckon you two might be keeping us on the right path more than slowing us down." The decision made, they spent the evening planning their joint travel. The practical matters of combining their journey provided a welcome distraction from the anticipation that grew as night approached their first as husband and wife. When it was finally time to retire, the Millers tactfully arranged for the newlyweds to have privacy, offering them the use of their smallest wagon for the night while the family slept under the stars. Alone together in the confined space of the wagon, with only a small lantern illuminating the darkness, Grace felt a sudden shyness despite the weeks they had spent in each other's constant company. Jake seemed to sense her nervousness, moving slowly as he sat beside her on the simple bedroll Martha had arranged. "We don't have to rush anything," he said softly, taking her hand. "Just because we spoke vows today doesn't mean—" Grace silenced him with a kiss, her initial hesitation melting away with the certainty of her love for this man. "I want to be your wife in every way," she whispered against his lips. "I'm just new to this." Jake's smile was tender in the lantern light. "So am I, in a way. Never been anyone's husband before." His expression grew more serious. "We'll learn together, Grace. Everything about being partners, including this." His gentle understanding broke through the last of her uncertainty. As the lantern light flickered, and the sounds of the night surrounded their small sanctuary, Grace and Jake discovered the final dimension of their partnership, their touches and whispered words of love binding them together as completely as the vows they had exchanged under the open sky. The next morning brought knowing smiles from the adults of the Miller family, but no direct comments, for which Grace was grateful. As they prepared to continue their journey, now as part of a small wagon train rather than solitary travelers, she felt a new confidence in her step and a deepened connection to Jake that manifested in small touches and shared glances throughout their morning routine. Traveling with the Millers proved to be a positive change. The additional company and resources made certain aspects of the journey easier, while Jake's experience with the route made him a valuable guide for the group. Grace found herself particularly enjoying the presence of the children, who eagerly accepted her as a teacher during the evening stops when she would conduct impromptu lessons beneath the stars. "You're a natural with them," Jake observed one evening, watching as she helped 8-year-old Thomas sound out words from her mother's Bible. "Our own children will be lucky to have you as their mother someday." The casual mention of their future family sent a warm flutter through Grace's heart. They hadn't discussed children specifically, but the assumption that they would have them someday felt right, another piece of the life they were building together. The combined party made good progress, covering ground more efficiently than either would have alone. Jake's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable when they faced a difficult river crossing, and Samuel's skill with wagon repairs saved them precious time when one of the wheels cracked on a particularly rocky stretch of trail. 11 days after the wedding, they reached a fork in the trail that would separate their paths. The Millers would continue north toward the land claims they sought, while Jake and Grace would turn westward toward the Willamette Valley and Lafayette. "Wish you were coming with us," Martha said as they prepared for their final evening together. "Grown mighty fond of you both." Grace embraced the older woman who had become something of a surrogate mother during their short time together. "Perhaps our paths will cross again someday. The West isn't so large that good friends can't find each other." The parting the next morning was emotional but hopeful. Addresses were exchanged with promises to write once they were settled, and the children extracted solemn vows from Grace that she would continue her stories in letters. With final waves and calls of good fortune, the two groups set off in their separate directions. "Think we'll ever see them again?" Grace asked as she and Jake rode side by side, the sound of the wagons fading behind them. Jake considered this thoughtfully. West has a way of bringing people together when you least expect it. Wouldn't surprise me if we cross paths again someday. Their journey continued westward, the landscape gradually changing as they approached Oregon territory. The terrain became more forested, the rivers wilder, the signs of settlement more frequent. They began to encounter other travelers more regularly, trappers heading to trading posts, settlers moving between established communities, even the occasional mail carrier on horseback. From these encounters, they gleaned more specific information about Lafayette and the surrounding Willamette Valley. By all accounts, it was indeed the fertile paradise Jake had described, with a growing community that included several families with children of school age. "Sounds like there will be plenty of pupils for your school," Jake commented after one such conversation with a trader heading east. Grace nodded, excitement building as their destination grew closer. And he mentioned good grazing land still available just outside the settlement. Exactly what we've been hoping for. 23 days after their wedding, they crested a final ridge to see the Willamette Valley spread before them in the late afternoon light. The sight took Grace's breath away, a patchwork of green meadows, dark forests, and the silver ribbon of the river winding through it all. In the distance, they could make out the small cluster of buildings that must be Lafayette. Jake reined Brutus to a halt beside Daisy, his face reflecting the same awe that Grace felt. "There it is," he said softly, "our new home." Grace reached across the space between their horses to take his hand. "It's more beautiful than I imagined." They camped that night on the ridge, wanting to approach the settlement in daylight. As they sat by their fire, looking out over the valley that would be their home, Jake pulled a small package from his saddlebag. "Been saving this," he explained, handing it to Grace. Wanted to wait for the right moment. Curious, she unwrapped the cloth to find a simple gold band, a wedding ring. Her eyes widened in surprise. "When did you?" "Traded for it with Samuel before we parted ways," Jake explained. "He had it from his mother, said he'd been saving it in case one of his children needed it someday. When I mentioned wanting to get you a proper ring, he insisted I take it." He looked slightly embarrassed. "Gave him my good hunting knife in exchange, figured it was worth it." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as Jake took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. It fit nearly perfectly, a tangible symbol of the commitment they had made to each other. "It's beautiful," she whispered, admiring how it caught the firelight. "I'll treasure it always." Jake kissed her, then drew back with a smile. "Thought you should have it before we start our new life down there. Wanted to do this part proper at least." Grace laughed softly. "There's nothing improper about how we've come together, Jake Lawson. Our story may be unusual, but it's ours, and I wouldn't change a moment of it." They spent that night making plans for their arrival in Lafayette the next day, where they would stay initially, how they would introduce themselves, what steps they would take to establish their new life. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. As dawn broke over the valley, they packed their few belongings for the last leg of their journey. Before mounting their horses, Jake pulled Grace into his arms for a lingering kiss. "Ready, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked when they finally separated. Grace smiled up at him, her heart full of love and anticipation. "Ready, Mr. Lawson. Let's go home." They rode down into the valley together, side by side as they had been since the day Jake had returned for her when everyone else had left her behind. What had begun as an act of compassion from a stranger had become the foundation of a life neither could have imagined when they first set out on the trail. As Lafayette grew closer, Grace reflected on the strange twist of fate that had led her here. A twisted ankle that should have been a disaster had instead brought her the greatest blessing of her life. Sometimes, she realized, being left behind was simply the first step toward finding where you truly belonged. When they rode into Lafayette that afternoon, they were greeted with the curious but welcoming attention typical of frontier settlements. The small community of approximately 200 souls was visibly growing, with new construction evident at the edges of the established buildings. The local general store served as both merchant and informal community center. Its proprietor, a jovial man named Henry Wilson, provided them with information about available accommodations and introduced them to several key residents who happened to be present. A school teacher, you say, Mrs. Peterson, a formidable woman who seemed to hold unofficial authority in the settlement, peered at Grace with sudden interest. Well now, that's providential timing. We've been trying to establish a proper school for nearly a year. Have 15 children of learning age already, with more families arriving each month. Jake squeezed Grace's hand encouragingly as she explained her qualifications and experience. By the end of the conversation, Mrs. Peterson had all but appointed Grace as Lafayette's official teacher, promising to call a community meeting within the week to formalize arrangements. And your husband's interest in ranching is equally welcome, Mrs. Peterson continued. The Davis property 3 miles east of town might suit your purposes. Good water, decent grazing land. Owner passed last winter, and his widow's looking to sell before returning east. Jake nodded appreciatively. We'd be interested in seeing it if Mrs. Davis is willing. I'll arrange it for tomorrow, Mrs. Peterson assured them with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making things happen. Meanwhile, Mrs. Turner runs a small boarding house that should accommodate you until you're settled. By sunset, Grace and Jake found themselves installed in a modest but clean room at Turner's boarding house, marveling at the rapid progression of events that seemed to be aligning perfectly with their hopes. The simple dinner, shared with other boarders, mostly single men working on various construction projects, provided additional insights into their new community. Seems like we've landed in the right place at the right time, Jake observed as they prepared for their first night in a proper bed since their wedding. School for you, potential ranch for me, growing community for us both. Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful as she brushed out her hair. It almost feels too perfect, doesn't it? Like a story with too neat an ending. Jake came to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the small mirror on the dresser. Not an ending, Grace. A beginning. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders. And real life isn't neat, we both know that. There'll be challenges ahead, same as there were on the trail. You're right, she acknowledged, covering one of his hands with her own. And whatever comes, we'll face it together. That's what matters most. The following day brought confirmation of their good fortune. Mrs. Davis, a dignified widow in her 60s, showed them her late husband's property with an emotional mixture of pride and resignation. The ranch was modest by Texas standards, 80 acres with a small but sturdy 2-room cabin, a barn, and a good well, but it represented everything Jake and Grace had hoped to find. Franklin would want it to go to people who'll care for it properly, Mrs. Davis explained as they toured the property. He put 10 years of his life into this land, built everything with his own hands. She looked directly at Jake. I can tell you're a man who understands the value of that, Jake nodded, respecting both her assessment and her loss. Yes, madam, I do. The price she named was fair, possibly even generous, and within reach of their combined savings. By the time they returned to town, the preliminary agreement had been made. Mrs. Davis would remain in the cabin for 2 more weeks while finalizing her preparations to return to her sister's home in Missouri. After that, the property would be theirs. Can you believe it? Grace marveled as they walked back to the boarding house, her hand tucked into the crook of Jake's arm. 2 weeks ago, we were still on the trail, unsure of what we'd find. Now we have a home, a teaching position for me, land for you. Jake smiled, enjoying her excitement. Almost makes me believe in fate, or at least in good fortune favoring the determined. The subsequent days passed in a flurry of activity. The community meeting regarding the school went exactly as Mrs. Peterson had predicted, with Grace officially hired as Lafayette's teacher. The town council had already designated land for a schoolhouse, and construction was set to begin within the month. Until then, classes would be held in the church building on weekdays. Meanwhile, Jake focused on preparations for taking over the Davis ranch. He purchased basic supplies, made arrangements to acquire a small starter herd of cattle from a larger ranch 30 miles south, and spent time learning about the specific challenges and opportunities of ranching in the Willamette Valley from established local farmers. 2 weeks later, they said goodbye to Mrs. Davis as she departed with the eastbound stage, her belongings reduced to what could fit in 2 trunks. Standing in front of the cabin that was now officially theirs, Jake and Grace felt the weight of their new beginning. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," Jake said softly, squeezing her hand. Grace smiled up at him, her eyes shining with happiness and determination. "Home at last, Mr. Lawson." The subsequent months brought exactly the mixture of joy and challenges that Jake had predicted. The school opened successfully, with 22 students ranging from 5 to 16 years of age. Grace quickly established herself as a respected figure in the community, her dedication to education and natural teaching ability winning over both children and parents. Jake's small ranching operation began modestly, but with promise. His experience with cattle proved valuable in the new environment, and his willingness to adapt his methods based on advice from successful local ranchers helped him avoid some of the common mistakes of newcomers. By winter, their finances were stable, with Grace's teaching salary supplementing the ranch's developing income. Their cabin, initially sparse and functional, gradually transformed into a true home. With each small addition, curtains sewn by Grace from fabric purchased at the general store, a rocking chair Jake crafted during the rainy evenings, bookshelves built to house Grace's slowly rebuilding collection, the space became more distinctly theirs. Winter in the Willamette Valley proved milder than they had experienced in their previous homes, but brought its own challenges with persistent rain and occasional flooding. The community drew closer during these months, with social gatherings, church events, and informal visiting filling the darker evenings. Jake and Grace found themselves increasingly integrated into Lafayette's social fabric, forming friendships that promised to last for years to come. Spring arrived with renewed energy and expansion. Jake added to their small herd and began planning additional improvements to the ranch. Grace's school continued to grow with the community, necessitating discussions about an assistant teacher for the following year. It was during this season of growth, almost exactly 1 year after they had been married on the trail, that Grace shared the news they had both been hoping for. "Jake," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, "I believe our family is going to grow before the end of the year." Jake turned to her, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. "You mean?" Grace nodded, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "Dr. Miller confirmed it today. We're going to have a baby, likely in early December." The joy that spread across Jake's face was everything Grace had hoped for. He gathered her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that expressed what words could not. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Jake's hand rested protectively over where their child grew. "I keep thinking about how it all started," he murmured. "If you hadn't twisted your ankle that day, if the wagon master had waited, if I had ridden on with the others, we wouldn't be here now," Grace finished for him. "Life turns on such small moments, doesn't it? What seemed like disaster was actually the beginning of everything good." Jake nodded, pulling her closer. "I think about that wagon train sometimes, where they ended up, whether they ever think about the two they left behind. I hope they found their own versions of happiness," Grace said thoughtfully. "But I can't imagine any of them found anything better than what we have." As summer ripened into autumn, preparations for the baby became their central focus outside of daily work responsibilities. Jake added a small third room to the cabin, working evenings and weekends to ensure it was completed well before Grace's confinement. The women of Lafayette, led by Mrs. Peterson, organized a baby shower that supplied them with handmade blankets, gowns, and practical advice for the months ahead. Grace continued teaching until November, when her advancing pregnancy and the onset of heavier winter rains made the daily journey to town impractical. A young woman named Sarah James, who had been assisting in the classroom for several months, took over primary teaching duties with Grace's guidance through weekly planning sessions. Winter settled over the valley just as Grace's time drew near. On a cold, clear night in early December, after a labor supported by the steady presence of both Jake and Mrs. Turner, who had become a dear friend and served as midwife for many of Lafayette's births, their son entered the world with a robust cry that immediately captured his father's heart. "He's perfect," Jake whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he held his son for the first time. Strong like his mother, Grace, exhausted but radiant, watched the two most important people in her world with overwhelming love. "What shall we call him?" she asked softly. Jake considered the tiny face, already showing hints of his own features in the shape of the nose and chin. "What about Thomas? After your father?" The suggestion touched Grace deeply. Though she had shared many stories of her parents with Jake, she hadn't expected him to propose honoring her family in naming their firstborn. "Thomas Jacob Lawson," she suggested in return. "So he carries both families forward." Jake nodded, carefully returning their son to Grace's arms. "Thomas Jacob it is. Welcome to the world, son. You've got quite a heritage to live up to. Your mother is the bravest, strongest person I know." "And your father," Grace added, looking up at Jake with eyes full of love, "is the man who stayed when everyone else left. Remember that, Thomas." Sometimes the truest courage is found in going against the crowd to do what's right. As the winter nights stretched long, the small family established new rhythms around Thomas's needs. Jake proved to be a devoted father, willing to walk the floor with their fussing son so Grace could rest, and taking on additional household duties without complaint. The cabin was often filled with the sound of his deep voice singing old cattle drive songs that seemed to soothe the baby better than any lullaby. Spring arrived again, bringing with it the second anniversary of their unconventional meeting on the trail. To mark the occasion, they invited close friends from Lafayette for a small celebration at the ranch, which had grown modestly but steadily under Jake's careful management. As twilight fell and their guests departed, Jake and Grace stood on their porch, Thomas sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. The valley spread before them, green and promising in the soft evening light. "Did you ever imagine when you stayed behind with me that day that this would be our life 2 years later?" Grace asked, leaning into Jake's embrace. Jake shook his head, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Couldn't have dreamed it would be this good. You, Thomas, this land." He gestured to the improvements visible around them: the expanded barn, the vegetable garden, the small orchard they had planted the previous spring. "It's more than I ever thought I'd have." Grace smiled, remembering his words from long ago. "We really did catch up together, didn't we? Just not in the way either of us expected." Jake chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Caught up and went beyond, and the journey's just beginning." As stars emerged in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, three hearts beating together in the home they had created. The wagon train was long gone, its destination reached, or perhaps changed along the way. But for Jake and Grace Lawson, being left behind had led them exactly where they were meant to be together, creating a legacy of love that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a dusty trail and would continue through generations to come. Thomas grew into a robust toddler with his father's quiet determination and his mother's curious mind. By the time he was 3, Grace had returned to teaching part-time, bringing him along to the now expanded schoolhouse 3 days each week. The arrangement worked well, allowing her to maintain her connection to the community while balancing her roles as mother, wife, and educator. Lafayette itself continued to grow, the population nearly doubling in the 5 years since Jake and Grace had arrived. The Lawson Ranch grew proportionally, with Jake gradually expanding their herd and improving their facilities. His reputation for fair dealings and quality livestock spread throughout the valley, bringing steady business and respect. In the spring of Thomas's 4th year, Grace discovered she was expecting their second child. The news brought fresh joy to their household, with Thomas excited about becoming a big brother once he understood what that meant. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through summer and fall, with the community once again rallying around them with support and preparations. On a blustery November evening, as the first serious storms of winter lashed at the windows of their expanded cabin, their daughter entered the world. Rose Elizabeth Lawson had her mother's features, and from her earliest days, showed signs of the same quiet strength that had carried Grace through the challenges of their journey west. "She's beautiful," Jake whispered, cradling his newborn daughter while Thomas peered curiously at his sister from his perch on the edge of the bed. "Like her mother. And stubborn," Grace added with a tired smile. "Coming right in the middle of the worst storm we've had this season." Jake chuckled. Lawson timing, never convenient, always memorable. As their family grew, so did their connections to the community and the land. The 10-year anniversary of their arrival in Lafayette was marked by a larger celebration, hosted at the schoolhouse that Grace now supervised with 2 assistant teachers under her direction. The event brought together nearly everyone in the settlement, many of whom had arrived after the Lawsons, but had been welcomed with the same community spirit that had embraced Jake and Grace. During the festivities, Thomas, now nearly 8, approached his parents with a question that had clearly been on his mind for some time. "Pa says you two met when a wagon train left you behind," he said to Grace, his expression serious beyond his years. "Why would they do that?" "Leave you all alone?" Grace exchanged a glance with Jake, who nodded encouragingly. They had shared abbreviated versions of their story with the children before, but perhaps it was time for Thomas to understand more fully. "I had hurt my ankle," Grace explained, settling onto a bench with Thomas on one side and 4-year-old Rose on the other. The wagon master was worried about reaching Oregon before winter, and he decided one person wasn't worth risking everyone's journey. Thomas's brow furrowed with the injustice of it. "That wasn't right." "No, it wasn't," Jake agreed, joining them. "That's why I stayed behind. Even though you didn't know Mama very well." Thomas pressed, trying to understand. Jake smiled, reaching across to take Grace's hand. Sometimes you just know when something is right, son, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. And sometimes, Grace added, what seems like bad luck turns out to be the beginning of the greatest adventure of your life. Thomas considered this, his young mind working to reconcile the apparent contradiction. So, getting left behind was actually good luck. For us it was, Jake confirmed. It led us to each other, to Lafayette, to you and Rose, to everything that matters most. This explanation seemed to satisfy Thomas, who nodded solemnly before running off to rejoin his friends in the games organized for the younger children. Rose followed her brother, leaving Jake and Grace alone for a moment amidst the celebration. "You ever wonder about them?" Jake asked quietly. "The wagon train, whether they made it, what became of them," Grace considered this. "Sometimes, I hope they found what they were looking for." She squeezed his hand. "But I know with absolute certainty that I found something better than anything I could have imagined then." Jake lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with the same tenderness he had shown since their earliest days together. "Best decision I ever made was turning Brutus around that day." As the years continued to unfold, the Lawson family thrived alongside Lafayette. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his father's practical skills with his mother's love of learning, eventually taking on increasing responsibility at the ranch while continuing his education through books and correspondence courses. Rose developed into a spirited young woman with a particular talent for mathematics and a determination that served her well as one of the first females admitted to the university in Portland. The ranch expanded to include a successful horse breeding operation alongside the cattle, with Jake's reputation for quality stock extending throughout Oregon and into neighboring territories. Grace's educational influence similarly expanded beyond Lafayette, as she helped establish a network of rural schools using teaching methods she had developed and refined over her years in the classroom. Their 20th anniversary was marked by a quieter celebration, just the two of them riding out to a hillside overlooking their property, a specially packed picnic lunch between them as they surveyed all they had built together. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked, her hand gesturing to encompass not just their expanded ranch but the larger community visible in the distance, where the church steeple and schoolhouse stood as landmarks of civilization in what had once been wilderness. Jake shook his head, his hair now touched with gray at the temples but his eyes still bright with the same steady strength she had first noticed on the trail. "Couldn't have dreamed it, not the scale of it anyway." He looked at her, the lines around his eyes deepening with his smile. "Though I did have some hope, that first night we camped together, that you might eventually look at me the way you're looking at me now." Grace laughed, the sound as clear and joyful as it had been when they were younger. "And how am I looking at you, Jake Lawson? Like I'm still that cowboy who stayed behind, and you're still glad I did." He reached across the blanket to take her hand, his touch as familiar and necessary as breathing after 20 years together. "I am," she confirmed softly, "every single day." As they watched the sun begin its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the valley in the same golden light that had welcomed them 2 decades earlier, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here, not just the physical journey across plains and mountains, but the longer journey of building a life together, raising children, contributing to a community, creating something lasting where once there had been only wilderness and dreams. What had begun with abandonment had led to belonging. What had started as two strangers facing an uncertain path had become a partnership that anchored not just their own lives but touched countless others through their ranch, her school, their children, and their place in the community they helped build. "We really did catch up together," Grace murmured, echoing words they had exchanged many times over the years, the phrase becoming something of a private motto for their life together. Jake nodded, understanding as he always did. "And then some," he agreed, drawing her close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "And then some."